Welcome everybody on the day after 9/11. We're all still here. Thank you for coming. Thank you especially to ROTC and Colonel Dutroux.
My name's Cognito.
You are? It must be the CIA training. My name is Colleen Sheehan. I'm the director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good. You don't have to remember any more than Ryan Center after that. I welcome you to stop by our offices on Old Albee 304. We have a large, well, not a large, we have a very good and solid student contingent that are part of the Ryan Center. And we're looking for a few good men and women to join us. So our mission is the study of constitutional government and of free institutions. And we are dedicated to protecting the inalienable rights of all humanity and to studying and preserving the rule of law. So if you're interested in any of those things, please join us. We'd love to have you. We host a number of lectures during the year. We have student groups a couple nights a week. One of them, Jay, where's Jay? Where are you, Jay? Jay is the head of the undergraduate students, a group called Debate America, and they debate contemporary issues in American politics, religion, society, and so on. And it's student-led, and the topics are student-chosen, and the pizza toppings are student-chosen as well. So there's always good food and good conversation. So please join us. There's a sign-up sheet outside if anybody wants to get on our mailing list, so you'll know when we're doing things and that you can come. I also want to thank our faculty associates, a number of whom are in attendance here today, as well as supporters of the Ryan Center. Admiral Joe Hare has been one of our biggest supporters for many years now, and I'm very grateful for that, Joe. And Andy and JP and Brian, and I think Chris Daly might be here. And Steve McGuire is our TWS fellow, his second year at the Ryan Center. And Austin Detweiler is our brand new, Steve's been here 2 years, Austin's been here 2 weeks, our brand new assistant director. And he's buzzing around, so I hope you meet him and welcome him to Villanova. Today's speaker is Dr. John Lenczowski, who served from 1981 to 1983 in the State Department, and from 1983 to 87 on the National Security Council as principal Soviet advisor to President Ronald Reagan. Do all you remember President Ronald Reagan? After his service in the government, Dr. Lenczowski founded the Institute of World Politics, an independent graduate school of national security and international affairs in Washington, D.C. I was down there and had the chance to tour it last year, and it's located right at the heart of all the foreign policy intrigue in Washington, D.C., and it's an amazing place. The Institute is dedicated to developing leaders with a sound understanding of international realities and the ethical conduct of statecraft, based on knowledge and appreciation of American founding principles and the Western moral tradition. Offering 5 master's degrees and 17 certificate programs, IWP is the only academic institution dedicated to teaching all the arts of statecraft in the United States. Dr. Lenczowski has been associated with several academic and research institutions in the Washington area, including Georgetown, American Enterprise Institute, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and others. He is the author of several books and articles and has written extensively on U.S. foreign policy, Soviet foreign relations, intelligence and counterintelligence, and integrated strategy. And I just learned today that he had a family member, a mother, who spent a couple years in the Gulag. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lenczowski.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Colleen, for your generous hospitality and introduction. I'm delighted to be here at Villanova. I've admired your school for many years, and it's been a great pleasure to get to know some of your professors here during the lovely luncheon which we just had. I wanted to just begin by expressing my appreciation to those of you who are signed up with the ROTC program. This is a sign of a wonderful form of active citizenship, of service to your fellow countrymen, and one hopes to the cause of peace and well-lubricated international relations in the world. I derive an enormous amount of hope for the future of our country when I see young people like you signing up for programs like this to serve a cause higher than yourselves. And so I thank you for this, and it makes me more of an optimist than a pessimist when I see you. It reminds me a little bit about the story of the Polish optimist and pessimist. The Polish pessimist says, this is one of these old stories from Cold War days and communist days. The Polish pessimist says, things just can't get any worse. And the Polish optimist smiles and says, oh yes, they can. Well, I am here to talk to you about some of the arts of statecraft. Colleen said that we at IWP specialize in teaching these different arts. And when I was serving in the government, I found that we do a lot of these things in the government, but we don't study many of them before we actually do them. And when it comes to military education, well, our armed forces are pretty serious about education in that profession. But when I was in the government, I discovered that 99% of intelligence officers had never studied intelligence before embarking upon that career. I discovered that virtually 100% of counterintelligence officers had never studied counterintelligence before embarking on that career. And I would argue that counterintelligence is as important an instrument of national power as any there is. A single spy can cause you to lose the war. A single agent of influence who isn't a spy but is operating, trying to exercise political influence under false pretenses can change the entire course of history. These are just a couple of the professions. We do some study of diplomacy. There are schools of international relations where we study traditional diplomacy, government-to-government relations, but there's a whole branch of diplomacy that nobody studies. It's called public diplomacy. It has to do with relations with people and not just governments. And it incorporates an entire spectrum, which includes cultural diplomacy, exchanges, visitors programs, educational exchanges, for example, information policy, international radio and television broadcasting, which now includes internet. And then it segues into other forms of strategic influence that include information operations in war, countering foreign propaganda and disinformation. It includes political action, political warfare, ideological warfare, and psychological strategy. Nobody studies these things. It's amazing to me. And yet these are things that happen in the world. And sometimes the United States actually does some of these things as well. And yet people are not professionally prepared to do it. There are other instruments of statecraft that aren't regularly studied. There are elements of economic strategy. For years, nobody was studying sanctions, economic warfare, boycotts, embargoes, blockades. They weren't studying technology security policy, financial security policy, defense industrial infrastructure policy. Maybe some people at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces would study the last one, defense industrial infrastructure policy. But these are all subjects that, where responsible activity has to be undertaken for the defense of our country, but where people are not adequately prepared. I once had to go into the Oval Office and brief the President of the United States about sanctions towards certain countries. And actually, I wasn't the person who was supposed to do this. The Director of International Economic Affairs was supposed to do it, but he was out of the office that day, and I was the next logical person. So I went in there and I had to wing it. And, I had studied international economics. I had studied economic warfare a little bit as a matter of personal curiosity, but I hadn't done it in a sufficiently rigorous fashion that I could be confident that I could give an A+ briefing to the President of the United States. This is not how to run a railroad. And by the way, there wasn't anybody else on what was a very powerful and well-educated NSC staff who could have done it at the time any better than me. So I'm concerned that we don't study many arts of statecraft that are not military ones. And part of the philosophy of the school that I started has to do with, we basically argue that if we use effectively the non-military arts and do it in an integrated strategic fashion, which is another issue which I'd like to get into a little bit more, because integrated strategy is a very difficult thing to do. It requires you thinking about other arts of statecraft other than your own, and how yours links up with the others. But if you use these things effectively, the non-military arts, you minimize the necessity of having to use armed force in order to defend your interests. And I would say that our armed forces are very significant proponents of this philosophy, because they don't particularly want to go and get killed. And they would prefer that we find other ways of doing things, and they're there for the last resort. All too often, we don't use them as a matter of last resort, and that's too bad, because there are other things that can be done. Look what's going on right now with North Korea. North Korea is doing all sorts of things that come straight out of the old Soviet Union's Cold War playbook. They are doing nuclear blackmail, they counterfeit currency, they violate arms agreements, they massive human rights violations, of course. They do propaganda, espionage, one thing after another. And now they're developing ICBMs, they're developing nuclear weapons, they're conducting this nuclear blackmail against us. And what are the options? Well, we've tried diplomacy to dissuade them for something like 2 to 3 decades from moving down this road, and it hasn't worked. And yet, if you read the opinion columns of the bien-pensants, the wise men, the right-thinking people in Washington, you get more recommendations for more of the same kind of diplomacy. Well, isn't one of the definitions of insanity, you do the same thing over and over and over again and think you're going to get a different result? We never get a different result. So, people are finally realizing diplomacy has failed. And probably will fail again. Surely will fail again. And so, what are the other options that are being offered? Well, one of them is more sanctions. Well, sanctions have gotten the North Korean regime to be, have put them under some very significant pressure in the past. But it hasn't caused regime change. It hasn't dissuaded them from getting away from their nuclear and nuclear missile delivery agenda. And they've found ways of eluding sanctions, which people, which nations, determined nations are usually able to do. And by the way, the Chinese are helping with this process. They are instrumental to this whole process in helping the North Koreans. Then, so what else? What are the other options? there is the option of military action. So there are different kinds of military action. There's deterrence, there's military display, we send aircraft carriers and so on and so forth. There's missile defense. I agree with all that stuff. Deterrence works, but it's got to be credible. And sometimes if the President of the United States or cabinet members make threats about fire and fury and so on and so forth, well, maybe if they attacked us, they will get fire and fury in retaliation. But, threats have to be credible. And maintaining credibility is one of the most difficult things to do in diplomacy, in strategy. And especially if you lose credibility. And some of our recent presidents have had an excellent record in losing our national credibility. President Obama drew a red line in the sand for Mr. Assad and said, if you use chemical weapons, this is unacceptable, we're going to have to take some military action. Of course, he apparently used the chemical weapons, and the President of the United States did nothing. All of a sudden, American threats are worth zilch. A threat is now just taken by others as a bluff. Well, now we have a new president. Maybe he means what he says when he makes threats. But you have to be very careful about how you make those threats. And you have to be able to persuade people that indeed the threat is credible. Was that all there is? Is that all we can do with North Korea? My answer is no. There's a lot more we can do. And maybe let me just back up before I supply you my answer for that, to show how various non-military instruments have had a strategic impact. We all have pretty much accepted the notion that the United States lost the Vietnam War. And indeed, ultimately, strategically, politically, we did lose it. But what I don't think we've come to grips with as yet, partly because of the way, it takes a long time for the truth to come out. But by 1972, the United States had won the Vietnam War militarily. This was manifest to the chief British diplomat in Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, already in the mid-70s, and he wrote as much in 1976 or 77. He said, by 1972, North Vietnam was prostrate, and all we had to do was dictate our political conditions. And we could have reunified Vietnam under South Vietnamese non-communist leadership. We didn't do it. What happened? Well, by 1972, we had become so disgusted with the war. And notwithstanding the fact that the polls consistently revealed that a majority of the American people supported the war in Vietnam all the way up to 1972 when we finally signed those final agreements with the North Vietnamese. Supported it. It was, a lot of people, college students and others subject to the draft who were demonstrating against it. And there was a lot of media opposition to it. But the American people still supported it. But Congress had pretty much taken the lead from the mainstream media and from the signals of dissatisfaction from the younger generation and decided to wash our hands of any involvement in Vietnam. By 1972, we had successfully Vietnamized the war. We had turned the war effort successfully over to the South Vietnamese armed forces, and such that they were able to prosecute the war themselves. And then, because of our disgust and our demoralization, we failed to resupply the South Vietnamese armed forces with the necessary equipment that they needed to defend themselves. And during the 3-year period between 72 and 75, the Kremlin sent in billions of rubles of arms to North Vietnam, and North Vietnam, rather than doing what they had tried to do in the South, which is their infiltration of the Viet Cong, which was, by the way, a group of infiltrators and not a group of indigenous fighters, none of that worked. None of that worked. What ultimately worked was a conventional armored invasion with Soviet military equipment rolling over the weak, undersupplied South Vietnamese defenses. And we're taking off from our helicopters from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in one of the most pathetic scenes in modern American history. How did this happen? And by the way, the North Vietnamese generals, as is now revealed in the North Vietnamese archives, were convinced that they were totally defeated by 1972. They're telling this to themselves. But ask them how they ended up winning the war in the end. Even though we won it militarily, we lost it politically. How? Because of the role of propaganda. North Vietnamese propaganda in league with international communist propaganda organized by the Soviet Union and coordinated amongst its various satellite states and their various media organs and front organizations. The Soviet Union ran hundreds of front organizations around the world. The most notorious of them was the World Peace Council. It had something like 150 affiliates in each of the different countries of the world. The Russian intelligence services, parenthetically, today, are still keeping that Soviet front organization alive. As a matter of fact, last summer when I was in Warsaw at the NATO summit, participating in the Warsaw Summit Experts Conference, there was a demonstration in New York City against NATO organized by the U.S. Peace Council, which is the old Soviet front organization resuscitated by Putin today. Propaganda works. Psychological operations work. And we had been demoralized to such an extent that we no longer had the will to fight. Now, obviously, in war, demoralization happens when you lose a lot of lives and you feel as though it's all futile. But look, it wasn't the case in so many examples. Look at the so-called Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War, where in almost a kind of a major last gasp, the North Vietnamese organized this massive offensive, gave it big publicity, and we smashed it. It was a complete American victory, and yet the Soviet and international communist propaganda apparatus, with remarkable influence in the Western media, managed to spin that whole battle as a defeat for the United States and the South Vietnamese. Propaganda works. And we don't take it seriously. We don't take seriously foreign influence in our country. George Washington and the authors of the Federalist Papers, the architects of this political system, warned in the farewell address, in George Washington's farewell address, in the Federalist Papers, warned about their fellow citizens about what they called the insidious wiles of foreign influence. And they argued that the Republican form of government is unusually vulnerable to foreign influence compared to monarchies. They identified the Achilles heel of our political system. And yet the national security establishment of the United States has only episodically taken this seriously. I note, for the record, that 24 members of the U.S. Congress at its heyday were members of the U.S. Peace Council, the Soviet front organization. Now, propaganda works. Yes?
Did they know what they were doing?
Did they know they were part of it?
Yeah.
Well, you know, front organizations are interesting. Some of them did, and there's probably some who may not have. And because fronts usually have a combination of people, of the organizers, who are actively, consciously working for, in this case, Moscow, and others who are sort of do-gooding innocents, you know, who are for peace, and joined a group that's called, you know, that has peace in its name, and think that they're doing good things. But, you know, when you're a member of Congress, you ought to be a little bit informed about the kind of organizations you're joining, and it wasn't unknown that this was a major Soviet front organization. So I can certainly ascribe, you know, innocent motives, perhaps to a few of them, but I'm frankly skeptical. So other countries can do this kind of stuff to us, and we have to be careful about it. There are, you know, when I came into the government in 1981, I discovered that we were not collecting any intelligence about Soviet propaganda, disinformation, fake news, active measures, etc. What's active measures? It's a KGB term of art that refers to disinformation, forgeries, and covert political influence operations. We were collecting no intelligence on this, and they were doing this in a very, very big way. The impact of this kind of thing can be enormous. During the 1930s, for example, there was a guy named Walter Duranty. He was the chief New York Times correspondent in Moscow. New York Times, #1 newspaper of record. In the 1930s, what was going on? Well, there were purges, there were collectivization, and one of the things that was going on was the Holodomor. Has anybody heard of the Holodomor? Anybody know what that means? Holodomor. It is the Ukrainian famine. It wasn't restricted to Ukraine. It was also in Kazakhstan and the Kuban in the Soviet Union. Between 7 and 11 million people were killed, were forcibly starved to death by Stalin and the Soviet Communist Party. When that many people are being killed and are being starved to death, it's a logistical problem. You've got to get the bodies to the mass graves. People don't starve to death all at once. They starve seriatim, you know, one after another, this day, that day, a few weeks later, etc. And in most of these Ukrainian villages, they don't have, you know, nice sleek hearses. They've got, you know, donkeys and horses and wagons, and you can't avoid seeing the bodies. Well, Mr. Duranty went down there to Ukraine, and he said, well, there have been rumors about all of this, but I'm here to tell you that there's no such thing. There's no famine going on down there. Well, Mr. Duranty was a Soviet agent of influence, working for what was called then the NKVD. The #1 correspondent, American correspondent in the Soviet Union, lying about one of the greatest human tragedies of the 20th century. And that was only a fraction of the people that were killed by Lenin and Stalin and the others. It could be upwards of 40 million people in the Soviet Union. I have a friend, I was talking about him at lunch. He's a scholar who was the London Financial Times correspondent in Moscow for a number of years. He wrote a book about the Soviet Union recently, and it's entitled, "It Was a Long Time Ago, and It Never Really Happened Anyway." Because we don't want to know about these things. We don't want to face up to them. We don't want to learn the lessons from them. And we are disinformed in our history books, in our media about these things. Mostly disinformed by omission. I was talking at lunch today about how Soviet perceptions management dynamics work, and how American professors just would not write about the three forbidden subjects. The taboo subjects: the Soviet military, Soviet espionage and secret police operations, and Soviet human rights violations. If you wrote about any of those things, you wouldn't get a visa to go to the Soviet Union. You couldn't go to do field work in the country of your expertise. You couldn't return to the United States and say, oh, I've been there and therefore I know, which is a complete specious argument, but everybody makes it all the time. And so American professors didn't write about the three taboo subjects. And today, American sinologists don't write about the three same taboo subjects about China. And so we don't know about what's going on. Because people want their visas. Propaganda works, perceptions management work, and that's what other countries can do to us. So what can we do to them? How do we conduct Cold War? You know, when people think about the Cold War, they think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, they think about submarines facing off against each other in the deep sea, they think about you know, fighter planes intercepting each other, they think about Berlin blockade, you know, a lot of things that focus on military, and then there's all of the spy stuff. But you know, there was something else going on. And I would like to explain why I think we won the Cold War. I think there are about 20 different reasons why. You could say that denying technology to the Soviet Union contributed to it. We even did some pretty fun things. We once got a defector to give us the whole wish list of technologies, a huge wish list of technologies that the Soviet Military Industrial Commission wanted to acquire or steal in the West. And we identified a few of the most sensitive ones, and then we went to the companies that were making them and said, please doctor these blueprints and please doctor the software. And then we let the Soviets steal it. And when they brought it back, they had a really bad day. It didn't work. And they didn't know why. And maybe it finally dawned on them that we sabotaged it. We did some material things like that. We did a military buildup that put pressure on their military-industrial economy. And we forced them into a crisis of that military economy. The consumer goods economy, their crisis started in 1917. We supported the anti-Soviet resistance forces in Afghanistan and Nicaragua and Angola and Mozambique and a few other places. We lowered the oil prices. We got the Saudis to increase production, and when you increase production, something is less scarce. It becomes cheaper. And when the oil price went down, well, oil and gas were some of the principal forms of hard currency used by the Soviet Union. And so all of a sudden they had less hard currency that they could use in the world markets to buy the things that they wanted to buy. All of these are material things. And we did it, we launched SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, missile defense, which was like a trump card against their ICBM forces. But all of that material stuff doesn't explain how 1 million people can take to the streets of Moscow and demand radical political change. Anybody who takes to the street in a totalitarian country usually gets arrested, thrown in the Gulag archipelago for slave labor, and maybe death, certainly lower life expectancy. Maybe they're killed, punished in some way. You just don't do that. How do 1 million people get enough courage to go out in the street and risk that punishment, such that they have created so much of a critical mass that the party starts having a crisis of self-confidence and ends up finally collapsing? I'll tell you how. People have to develop courage. In a totalitarian country, the most important thing, the most important act of political life in totalitarian countries is the illegitimacy of the regime. Legitimacy is a very big deal. We take it for granted in the United States. Our government's ruled here by the consent of the governed, and we think that this is a just way of doing things, and people are governed, those who occupy high office, whether it's federal, state, or local, are there confidently that they're with the people, that they are there with the people's consent. But people who rule without the consent of the governed have an internal security problem. They are afraid of their own people. The Bolsheviks knew very well that they were ruling, that they had seized power without the consent of the government. Right after the revolution, there was an election to the Constituent Assembly that had been scheduled beforehand, and the Bolsheviks lost. The SRs won, the so-called socialist revolutionaries, who were a non-communist, non-violent socialist party. The people did not vote for the Bolsheviks, yet they were the ones who seized power. They knew their people would not choose them, so they had fear of their own people. That's I repeat, the central fact of political life in these types of regimes. It goes for China today, for Cuba today, for Cambodia, for Vietnam, for North Korea, etc. You could even say it goes for Iran. And so what do you do about your internal security? You've got to get people, first of all, to be physically incapable of doing anything. That means you can't get them to organize in resistance cells. You have to penetrate every single organized body in the society with your agents, with your secret police people, your informants. In East Germany, because of the accuracy of the archives and our unimpeded access to it, we know that 25% of the East German population were informants to the Stasi. 25%. That means your sister, your uncle, some people in your immediate, it isn't just a whole bunch of people who live in the northwest corner of the country. It's everybody around you. And you don't know who they are, because the informants are not supposed to say who they are. And if they do, they may run into trouble. If they say who they are, they may say it to another informant who will report on them. People are forced into this against their will. So you create, you penetrate the sports clubs, you penetrate the garden society. They didn't have garden societies in communist countries, excuse the error. Penetrate any organized social body so that it doesn't become a front for internal resistance against the regime. And because of that, you create an atmosphere of mistrust, and you atomize society. Atomization is a key feature of totalitarian rule. You separate every individual from everybody else. Atomization is like a little spray bottle, and every little droplet is separated from all the rest of the droplets so that it isn't a liquid anymore. Because nobody can trust anybody else. And nobody, therefore, can have, the individual stands alone against the all-powerful state and cannot organize, because of this mistrust, cannot organize cells of internal resistance. Then you've got all the other aspects of the internal security, the monopoly of information and communication, the total control over education, over textbooks, over film, over entertainment, complete control of the economy, of all decisions that have to do with what gets produced and how it's distributed. Control over internal travel. It was easier to escape from the slave labor camp system, the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, than it was to travel from one town to another inside the Soviet Union without 6 different authorized documents in order, which would be checked because you couldn't travel without those. An internal passport. Imagine an internal passport. This is what totalitarian countries do. Cannot travel. Cannot change jobs, can't move to that town to have a job because you can't have a job unless you have housing. But you can't get housing unless you have a job. So it's a catch-22. This is totalitarianism. It keeps people in their place. But above all, you've got to keep people thinking the same way. You've got to create enforced conformity. And this is where internal propaganda and the Communist Party line, the ideological party line, serve as the instrument of enforced conformity. They're like the drum beating for soldiers marching. Soldiers march in order to eliminate nonconformity, in order to get discipline so that your voluntaristic impulse to do something different in your orders is basically erased. You've got to follow orders until such time as you're high enough in the chain of command that you may start having some discretion over what the strategy or the tactics may be. Then you've got to get people induced into a sense of futile resignation, a psychological state of futile resignation, where you come to the conclusion that resistance is futile. One of the great dissidents coming out of the old Soviet system was a guy named Vladimir Bukovsky. He was the first dissident received in the Oval Office by an American president. He once explained that Soviet foreign policy, and by the way, this is a lesson that applies to China today, it applies to North Korea today, and the others. The foreign policy of these kinds of powers is designed to send a message to the people. Attention, people of the Soviet Union. We can shoot down civilian Korean airliners with the air into our airspace. We can we can invade Afghanistan. We can send arms to the Nicaraguan communists right under the nose of Uncle Sam, and not even the greatest imperialist power in the world can resist us, can stop us. We are riding the crest of an inexorable wave of history. Now, the imperialists have nuclear weapons. They've got navies that sail the seas. They cannot stop us. Then, if they can't stop us, and they're free to do all this stuff, how can you people behind the Berlin Wall, behind 200,000 KGB border guards and the concertina wire and their snarling dogs, how can you even contemplate resistance? Resistance is futile. The task to get people out of that psychological state, out of atomization, out of enforced conformity, out of thought control and speech control, which is the precursor to behavior control, is to break the monopoly of information, break the monopoly of communications, and to make the people feel that they are not alone. If you're all alone, and you don't feel anybody has got your back, you're going to be pretty demoralized. The Secretaries Mattis and Tillerson just wrote an article a week or so ago in the Wall Street Journal saying, we do not seek regime change in North Korea. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. That sends a message of comfort to Kim Jong-un and his criminal Communist Party. A message of comfort. And it sends a message of demoralization to the North Korean people. that we don't really care about their human rights. We don't care about their freedom. We don't care about political change in their system, which is the only thing that is going to remove tensions. During the 1970s, they tried to do a policy of détente with the Soviet Union, a relaxation of tensions. Excuse me, arms control agreements and all this kind of stuff. You're not going to have a relaxation of tensions by reducing the symptoms of tension. You can't have a real relaxation of tensions until you've eliminated the source. And those are political concerns. And the political concerns were an expansionistic, aggressive, subversive power, superpower, that is trying to make communist takeovers around the world, that is engaging in nuclear blackmail, that is engaging in propaganda and subversion and so on and so forth, and that when they get control of and when their political system is established, it's massive human rights violations and human suffering everywhere you go. Those are political concerns. Those are legitimate concerns. You're not going to get rid of the tensions by having diplomacy. I like to tell our students at IWP there are two different types of creatures in the forest. There are carnivores and there are herbivores. And the carnivores have in their genetic code to do certain things, and that's to eat other animals. And you're not going to get a carnivore to stop eating other animals by negotiating with him. You have to change his genetic code, or you have to kill him. You have to destroy the nature of that system. What these regimes fear most is the truth. They fear unfiltered information because they want their people to be cowed and kept in a state of conformity through their propagandistic monopoly of information. They fear democratic ideas because they fear a competitive legitimizing instrument of state authority, namely the consent of the government. They fear this more than anything because that can arouse the internal security threat. We defeated the Soviet Union by getting the people to feel as though they weren't alone, a president who stopped censoring himself about the nature of the Soviet system and started telling the truth about it. I actually saw a draft of Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech, which came across my desk. It didn't have Evil Empire in it, those words. I actually had some doubts about whether it was a good thing for him to say that in those words. I preferred that he would have done it in a different way, without using adjectives, but he did it. And the fact of the matter is, when he said it was an evil empire and that he cared about the human rights of the people, the suffering peoples of the Soviet Empire, those words reverberated into the dankest corridors of the Gulag. And prisoners of conscience like Anatoly Sharansky and others heard those words and they said, finally somebody is bearing moral witness. Somebody has got the courage to tell the truth. Somebody has our back morally, if no other way. And then we launched a major modernization campaign for the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian author, called those radio stations, which broadcast in shortwave and other wavelengths, to the denied areas that were denied a free press. He called them the most powerful weapon the United States had in the Cold War. The most powerful weapon. The foreign policy establishment of the United States of America does not understand Solzhenitsyn's logic. Could not explain to them why he said that. He said, quote, the power that resides in the airwaves to kindle the human spirit is beyond the scope of the Western imagination. Why is that? Well, we take unfiltered information for granted. We don't live with a centralized propaganda system. There are a lot of biased media of many different stripes, but we figure you have enough sources, maybe you'll finally figure out what's going on. But over there, all their understanding of the world was shaped by the internal propaganda system. Here we were sending the truth to them, for which they thirsted more than the basic necessities of life. We sent them alternative ideas, including democratic ideas. We gave them religion. The US government was playing religious services over the airwaves. It's completely a bogus argument today that we can't talk about Islam, when, in fact, we were giving religious services of different faiths over those radios. We gave them their history, the true history when their regimes were trying to erase their history. Václav Havel, a playwright and a dissident, was the first president of non-communist Czechoslovakia. And when he came to Washington, D.C. in 1992 or 3 or whenever it was on the first state visit, where did he go? Did he go to the State Department and thank them for all those arms control negotiations? No. He went down to the Voice of America, and he thanked them for keeping his nation's dream alive for 40 years. Analyzation. There was a guy who got on a bus in Warsaw in 1955 or 56, and he started whistling a tune that he heard over Radio Free Europe, a tune that you couldn't hear on the local communist radio stations. And about 10 seconds later, somebody else on the bus started listening. And then somebody else. And then somebody else. And they all looked at each other. And they realized we are all secret listeners to this subversive radio station. And we're listening at pain of punishment. And we have now a bond between each other that came through a very sort of subtle and secret way. A song. Maybe these are people whom I can trust. Breaks down atomization. Another thing these regimes fear, the instantaneity of information. Today there are 70,000 civil disturbances in China every year. These are demonstrations, riots, and protests against Communist Party corruption in various places all over that communist country. It's run by a totalitarian party that gives the world the impression through its disinformation that it is no longer communist because it engages in some capitalistic business practices, just the way Lenin did in the 1920s. And whenever there's a civil disturbance in a communist country, what do? The methodology is go and shut off all communications for that time. In 1981, there were strikes in the Lenin shipyard in the Polish port of Gdansk. And of course, what did the Polish communist authorities do? They shut down all communications. And they said there were high winds that blew down the telephone wires. And of course, there was no free press to say that no, there weren't any high winds. So therefore, for the record, there must have been high winds. The Solidarity Strikers, the Solidarity Movement, developed an underground line of communication to the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, which broadcast the very fact of the strike to millions of Poles. Now, the normal methodology is cut off communications, crush the strike, and if the rest of the country learns about it after a few weeks or months or whatever, the message was not that there was a strike, but there was an attempted strike and that it was crushed. Resistance is futile, is the message. But if you can get the fact of that disturbance, of that strike, of that riot, that demonstration, to people before it's crushed, they might stand up on their hind legs at the same time. and all try to reclaim their human dignity in unison, in solidarity, which is why that word solidarity has such political impact. In a matter of weeks, you had 10 million people join this workers' movement in the so-called workers' state. And this was the beginning of a wildfire that spread to the Baltic states, that spread to the other Soviet republics, that spread to other places in Central Europe, and eventually ended up giving people so much courage that they could, 1 million people could take to the streets of Moscow. This is called public diplomacy. This is called information policy. This is called ideological warfare. This is called strategic communications. These are non-military instruments of power without which the Soviet Union, I argue, would still be here today. The Obama administration 3 years ago tried shutting down all shortwave broadcasts to China by the Voice of America, on the grounds that this was an obsolete technology, we've got to put it into the internet. Well, you know, only 15% of China is on the internet. There are more internet police in China than there are members of the People's Liberation Army, the largest army in the world. The internet sites are censored, and the web has been shut down entirely in several Chinese provinces for up to weeks or months at a time. Shortwave can be listened to anonymously. There's even a digital revolution in shortwave broadcasting called DRM, Digital Radio Mondiale, World Digital Radio. And it not only sends sound, it sends text and video. And you can look at it and see it anonymously, whereas you can't look at the internet. You can't do social media. You need anonymity to resist in a totalitarian country. We should be doing all these things. We should be sending in methods to break their monopoly of communications. Send in copying machines. Send in, and even rudimentary ones, mimeograph machines, mechanical, old-fashioned things that most of you don't know what they are. But they work. And they don't require kind of fancy software. And there are, right now, the North Korean regime has just put out a new hit list, an assassination list of about, 10 or a dozen defectors. And whom do they want assassinated? One of them is one of the key editors of Free North Korea Radio, broadcasting into North Korea. Another one of them is a fellow who sends information, USB sticks, leaflets, etc., via hot air balloons into North Korea. We should be flooding North Korea with information, with communications devices, with DRM receivers, which barely exist because there's no DRM broadcasting, but we should start it, and it's cheap. This is war. This is cold war. This is the non-military way of defeating toxic totalitarian regimes and attacking their center of gravity. In military strategy, Clausewitz explains you go after the center of gravity. What's the center of gravity? It's that without which they cannot survive. The center of gravity of these kinds of regimes is their internal security system. And I have just prescribed to you a whole bunch of different ways that we can take care of different elements of this. And guess what? North Korean defectors are recommending the very same thing. The foreign policy establishment in Washington is only beginning to pay attention. Anyway, that should be enough for now. Thank you.
My plan is to until 4:30, and we'll do Q&A. Dr. Lenczowski, I asked him to leave time because I think that this is a topic that there may be lots of questions and comments. Before we do this, though, I want to recognize somebody in the audience who actually had the courage to stand up against the totalitarian regime and was a member of Solidarity. And he's one of our professors here at Villanova, Dr. Martin. For many of you here in uniform, you're required to be Korean. It's part of who you are now. But it's sometimes a virtue that isn't high on a lot of millennials' lists, or even parents and grandparents of millennials. So it's something very much worth thinking about. Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Sir, Lieutenant Brown from the NRTC unit. So I have a question for you about that last point you just made. I heard once, and I'm not sure how valid this is, but it sounds true, that in North Korea, one thing that happens is a school teacher will say to like a 4th grade class, go home, you find this special book, and if you find this special book, you win a prize. And it's a Bible. And when they bring it in, their parents are gone, basically. And so, relating to what you're talking about, atomization, parents even being afraid of their own children, and thinking about, you need those devices to hear those radio broadcasts, USB drives with the facts on them from hot air balloons. What's the strategy to combat that level of atomization where even if your own children are finding these devices and bringing them into school and you disappear?
It's an excellent question. It's a devilish problem, and it has parents in these communist countries have had to be very careful about the indiscretions of their children, their children's ignorance of these realities. And of course, it's not just in North Korea. As you may know, in the Soviet Union, they were encouraging precisely children to turn in their parents who were speaking against the regime, and they built a statue to a certain certain child named Pavlik Morozov, who had turned in his parents, and they were sent to the Gulag and executed, and they built a statue in order to celebrate his civic courage. So it is a very difficult problem. It may be that one has to be thinking incrementally about these things. It may be that you don't start sending in all the devices as yet. It may be that you have to be, trying to get at some of these audiences to the extent that it is possible, using whatever existing technologies there may be. And then parents have to use their own discretion as to, how to handle their own children. This is, in totalitarianism works because the state penetrates every organized body of society, and penetrating the family is one of the key organized bodies, and destruction of it. And so, so that the state can raise the children and not parents. So there isn't an easy answer to that, and it's a prudential decision that the parents have to make, and it depends upon how much courage they have, how much of the risk they want to take, and all that. We can only try to give them the means, and it has to be their decision to play the game according to what they think is possible.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to compliment you. Starting with when you were talking about Vietnam, you presented it in a way a little different, and I think it's a battle that's still being fought in terms of what went on and what continues to go on. So I just wanted to give my compliments. Being one of the oldest people, I think, in this room, and remembering it from perhaps a different vantage point. When you were talking about the gentleman, the newspaperman, William Durante from the 1930s, so how do you know who he was? When did you find out? Who else would know about it? Can you give us background? Because that's the kind of information that would be an example that could be used presently. Like, this happened, we didn't know this. So for those people who don't believe in the foreign influence because it's disguised as an American newspaper man, could you give us more details on that?
Well, you know, I don't know that I could easily pinpoint a single authoritative source about Durante, but suffice it to say that the literature in this field is sufficiently rich with his particular example that he was really one of the most notorious of these types. There have been others in the West and in the United States who have been agents of influence. There was a famous case of one of the most important newsletter writers, Pierre Pathé in Paris, who was writing a newsletter for the French governmental elites. He was a Soviet agent of influence. There was a case of there was a Danish case. There are many of these are relatively modern cases from the from the 80s, for example. I was talking at lunchtime today about how we ended up persuading some people in the State Department to think about this seriously when we got a defector from the KGB who could come over to the State Department and start briefing people about this. His name was Stanislav Levchenko, and Levchenko was one of the top East Asia experts in the Soviet Union, and the KGB had pressed him into service. They eventually made him chief of Soviet active measures operations in Tokyo, where he had recruited, and he writes about this in his book. He has a book entitled, something like "On the Wrong Side," and he had recruited about a dozen working Chinese journalists to be Soviet agents of influence. He had recruited the editor-in-chief of the largest conservative newspaper in Japan. He had recruited the right-hand man of the publisher of the largest newspaper in Japan, and he had recruited about a half a dozen members of the Japanese parliament, all to be Soviet agents of influence. And they had these kinds of agents all over the place. And part of what we did when we started collecting intelligence on all this is we would start paying attention to stories, press reports that came out of different countries that didn't smell quite right. And so what you'd have is something published in the Times of India. Maybe an article about how the AIDS virus was manufactured by the chemical and biological warfare scientists at Fort Detrick in Maryland as a way of attacking other countries. Or another disinformation product from the KGB that the scientists at Fort Detrick had developed an ethnic weapon that would kill specifically dark-skinned people. There were all kinds of these disinformation stories. And then you'd see, oh, this would appear in the Times of India. And then, lo and behold, a Brazilian newspaper would pick it up, reporting what the Times of India said. And then, having been reported in Latin America, a half a dozen Latin American countries, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, they all publish it. And you start looking at who is writing the articles that pick up on that story. Some of them may be innocents who want to publish a sensationalist story. Some of them are agents of influence. Start looking at the patterns, and you see, aha, that guy seen working at the Times of India is clearly a paid, maybe even unpaid, because sometimes these people are unpaid and unwitting agents of influence, which is possible. It's very sophisticated. They are recruited, and they are goaded into writing stories without being paid and without being ordered to do so. And yet they're considered officially as state agents of influence. But you identify that person, and then you figure out the other people who regularly are picking up that. How many people in Brazil read the Times of India? Pretty strange, isn't it? And yet, Mr. Patel over here, and the journalist in India has written about the AIDS virus being an American chemical, biological weapon. Well, you look at these patterns, and you pretty soon you can start identifying who some of these people are. And then you get Mr. Bukovsky, the dissident I was telling you about, was actually given access to the Soviet Party archives by Boris Yeltsin in the first year or two after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he found a memorandum. Oh, he found all kinds of stuff in the party archives. He found a memorandum from then KGB chief Yuri Andropov, who eventually became general secretary of the party, to the Politburo, the highest decision-making body in the Soviet Union, outlining KGB financing and support of the Black Panther Party in the United States. Yes. Black on white, right there. The document. Okay? Radical chic. Celebrate the Black Panthers. Well, they were a Soviet-funded. And then he found a memorandum that had a list of the different American journalists and editors who were KGB agents of influence. He found that such a document existed, but the archivist wouldn't give it to him. But such a thing had to exist. So one learns about these things. There is some literature about this sort of thing. And so Durante just happens to be one of the most notorious. Any other questions? Sir?
Hi. Thanks again. Very interesting talk. But I was just wondering, are you familiar with Nelson DeMille's book, Charm School? And if so, the plausibility. Nelson DeMille's Charm School. Have you heard of that book? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was wondering if it was at all plausible. The basic concept is there's like Americans who have been like that were MIA, essentially like people they parachuted out or something like that. They landed, no one saw them, and then they were in the Soviet Union, and they would have their spies be taught by these Americans, like American customs. I mean, it's a fictional book, but I was just wondering if it's at all plausible.
It's easy enough to recruit Americans who are, American communists to go over there and teach Russians how to, and other people in the Soviet Union about American culture and concepts and so on and so forth. And it's not as if they didn't use some of those Americans as their own agents themselves. There's a guy named Vladimir Posner. You can look him up. Vladimir Posner was raised in Brooklyn. He's got a perfect Brooklyn accent. He's the son of communists. And he was, then the family moved to the Soviet Union, and he became, and then they eventually used him as one of the principal Kremlin spokesmen on the American media. And he spoke beautiful Brooklyn English, and sounded like an American. And if you didn't know who he was, you would think, oh, well, he's got some plausible arguments, and we ought to listen to what he says because he's clearly an American just like us. So, they've done that kind of thing for years, and Posner, I think, is probably still at it. We're now working for Putin.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, at the beginning of the lecture, you talked about how war was the last option on the table, and that we should exhaust all other measures before, reaching that final point. But later, it seems like you sort of defended the Vietnam War in 1972. Since what we learned through the Pentagon Papers, do you really think that the United States exhausted every possible measure in dealing with Ho Chi Minh before taking that final step into the military direction?
It's a good question. I think that sometimes war is necessary, especially when people are either invading or are conducting guerrilla operations, the way the North Vietnamese were doing in the South, which is another version of invasion. And I think that, this is obviously a very complicated war because the North Vietnamese communists were as effective as they were because they were able to harness the nationalist spirit and the anti-colonialist spirit, which they were able to use against the French, and where they started equating us with the French when we are a non-colonialist, and basically had a history of anti-colonialism and helped break up the colonial empires, both at the end of World War I and finally at the end of World War II. And so I think that there were complexities about that war which gave the North Vietnamese certain advantages politically, which, you know, if we had been able to have a better information policy, if we had been able to reach the Vietnamese people, including the North Vietnamese people, more effectively than we did, then maybe he wouldn't have been as effective in mobilizing the forces that he did mobilize. You know, that presupposes our ability to have a vigorous public diplomacy and information program, which we did not have into it. I happen to think that our involvement in Vietnam was morally and strategically the right thing to do. You know, the Vietnam War went on for several decades in Vietnam, first with the French and then the United States. And during the entire time of that war, there were no refugees coming out of Vietnam. When did the refugees come? It's when communism was victorious. I ask my students, and I'll ask you, what would it take you to sell all of your belongings, sell your house, sell your car, for some gold, take your little bag of gold, and march over to the Jersey Shore, and get into a boat that hasn't been inspected by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and destined for parts unknown, where there's only a few things guaranteed. One is you pay almost all your gold to the boatman. Second thing guaranteed, the rest of your gold will be stolen by pirates. Third thing that'll be guaranteed, all your women will be raped. And the fourth thing that's almost a guarantee is that when you arrive at destination unknown, you'll probably be deported back to Vietnam or back to the Jersey Shore and then sent to a re-education camp in the Poconos. What would it take? It didn't take several decades of war to produce that. It took the victory of communists. We talk a lot about the Holocaust in the United States, but we don't talk about 40, 50 million people killed in the Soviet Union. You've never heard the word Holodomor. You've heard Holocaust. You've never heard Holodomor. How many people were killed in China? Between 50 and 100 million people by the antecedents of this regime that's in power today, that runs the party according to the same prescriptions of party organization, party discipline, and internal security that Mao Zedong did. Did I mention the Lao guy? Did I mention that word, the Lao guy? Anybody know here, except those who were at lunch with me today, what the Lao guy is? You all should. Everyone of you should know what the Lao guy is. L-A-O-G-A-I. It's the Chinese slave labor camp system that is alive and well today, where millions of people are being enslaved. You don't know about it. And I'll tell you one reason why, and I mentioned this at lunch today. What are the three most important newspapers in the United States? The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. All three of them get millions of dollars from Beijing's propaganda ministry to publish a China Watch supplement, which is a news supplement of 8 to 11 pages. In the Wall Street Journal, it's only 2 pages, which is straight Chinese Communist propaganda. The New York Times and the Washington Post are big money losers. They need every dime they can get. And they have the temerity to take Chinese propaganda money to publish this stuff. Does this China Watch supplement influence a lot of people? I don't think so, actually. What I think does influence people is what is not reported about Chinese strategic developments that are inimical to the national security of the United States. So this is perceptions management. This is propaganda. So people don't know about these things. And I think that the defense of South Vietnam against the communization attempts by the North was morally and strategically a noble and correct thing for the United States to do. For all of the failures we had in some of the ways we initially conducted that war, and the way our leadership failed to tell the American people why we were there, and our failure to address the full spectrum instruments of statecraft that were targeted against us by North Vietnam and the international communist propaganda apparatus. You don't know about what's going on with Chinese strategic developments because the media aren't telling you. I asked at lunch today, have you heard about the hypersonic missile that Beijing has made, probably with stolen American technology? It goes Mach 8 to Mach 10. You heard about anti-satellite weapons that they've made? I was speaking again, and forgive me for those of you who are lunch. I was telling my nephew who went to the Naval Academy that when he arrived there, if they're going to teach him some navigation, that he better learn celestial navigation. Because the Chinese could, or the Russians, or maybe others, with cyber tools, could take out our GPS system. And if he knows how to use a sextant, maybe he'll be the only officer in the Navy who knows how to bring his ship back to port. Knows where he is. Interestingly, about 3 years after I gave him that warning, the Navy restored celestial navigation instruction to its officers. Good. Have you heard about the underground Great Wall? People at lunch did. What's the underground Great Wall? It is a warren of tunnels in China, which is concealing their nuclear arsenal. How big is the nuclear arsenal? I don't know that we really know. American intelligence says a couple of hundred. Russian intelligence says it's 16 to 1,800. That may be more than we have. These are steel and concrete reinforced tunnels through which you can drive a truck, behind which is dragged a road mobile ICBM launcher. What's strategically significant here is how big it is. The best estimate that I have seen is 3,000 miles. You know, if the U.S. Metropolitan Transit Authority tries to build a subway line from downtown Washington, D.C. to Dulles Airport, it'll set us back another $1 trillion in our national debt. One of the biggest lies you will ever hear in the media, and responsible people seem to repeat this, is that the American defense budget is bigger than the combined defense budgets of the next 10 countries. Is building islands in the South China Sea not a military expenditure? Is the underground Great Wall not a military expenditure? The underground Great Wall may not be 3,000 miles. Maybe it's only 2,000 miles. Maybe it's only 750 miles. It still would be staggering. But you don't know about it because none of those newspapers report this kind of stuff. And the professoriate doesn't write about it. And there is corruption involved. I told the story at lunch today about a China military analyst at a famous think tank in town. One of several stories of corruption. He was writing clinical, dispassionate analysis of the Chinese military buildup and its technological developments, the incredible number of technologies that have been stolen from the United States. And a major donor to that think tank, who gives them a 6-figure donation every year, had major China business interests and didn't like what this guy was writing because he thought it would alarm too many Americans and that could rile up U.S.-China tensions. So we arranged to have the guy fired and given hush money. And then we went to another think tank, and two trustees who were major financial benefactors threatened to resign from the board, threatened to withhold their financial support unless the guy was fired. He was fired from there too. How many spies are Chinese spies are in the United States? Every time I'm in front of some people in the U.S. counterintelligence community, I'll say that maybe there are 10 or 10,000 spies or something like that, intelligence collectors. But these are not all professional intelligence case officers. These are individual intelligence collectors that may include the graduate student at the Georgia Tech's physics department, another graduate student in the biochemistry department at MIT, and steal just one thing. Just steal your professor's latest scientific technological breakthrough. In fact, there are as many as 50,000 Chinese intelligence collectors. One place you can hear about it is the Washington Times, which doesn't take China's money.